What would your younger self say about how your family turned out?
When your own mother looks straight through you as if you were made of glass, when your father only turns toward you to complain about how much space you take up, you begin to wonder whether you truly exist at all. That realization hit me early in life, not in one single moment, but in a collection of quiet humiliations that stacked one over another until the weight became unbearable. I wasn't a dramatic child, I wasn't demanding, I wasn't the one throwing tantrums or breaking things. I simply sat at the table, hoping that someone would remember I was there. But in my family, the spotlight never flickered in my direction. It was permanently fixed on my brothers, who could do no wrong, who were lifted up like miniature kings on thrones made of excuses and praise. Birthdays in my house were a spectacle for them: banners, cakes so tall they leaned under the weight of frosting, piles of gifts that made the living room look like a department store. When mine came around, sometimes it passed with nothing more than a distracted "oh, happy birthday," delivered by my mother as she stirred spaghetti sauce and glanced at the clock. I remember once, when I turned 12, sitting alone in my room with a single cupcake I bought for myself from the gas station across the street, whispering "happy birthday" under my breath because no one else had remembered. It wasn't just one year. It was every year, and every holiday, and every family gathering where I was little more than background noise to the Golden Boys' endless parades of achievements. School events made the pattern even sharper. My parents would pack into the auditorium with camcorders when my brothers had football games, talent shows, or spelling bees. For me, they forgot permission slips, lost the dates of my choir concerts, and once left me standing outside the school after dark when they lost track of time. I sat there hugging my knees on the curb until a janitor asked if I needed help and offered to call someone. That was the night I realized no matter what I did, no matter how loud I might try to be, my presence would never register the way theirs did. As adults, nothing changed. My brothers' mistakes were brushed off as charming stumbles in otherwise brilliant lives. If one crashed a car, Dad laughed it off as boys being boys. If one flunked a class, Mom spoke with teary eyes about how the system just doesn't understand him. Meanwhile, if I asked for help with rent in my early 20s while juggling 2 jobs and night classes, I was scolded for bad life choices and told that I should learn to fend for myself. The irony was sharp. I had been fending for myself since I could tie my own shoes. The family dinners became unbearable, though I still went for a time out of some desperate, half-dead loyalty to the idea of family. I'd sit at the table while my parents laughed, filling wine glasses, complimenting one brother's new job and the other's new girlfriend. I might as well have been a shadow on the wall, invisible and unneeded. Sometimes, I'd speak up, mention something from my own life, a project I was working on, a small promotion at work, and the room would fall silent for a beat before one of them redirected the conversation back to the boys. My words evaporated into the air as if they'd never been spoken, and the humiliation clung to my skin like smoke. There was one night, a winter evening when the snow pressed up against the windows, that I remember most vividly. My brothers were home, bragging about vacations they were planning, cars they wanted to buy, and how Mom and Dad would help. My father was smiling, my mother beaming, while I sat in silence with an empty plate. They hadn't even noticed they never served me dinner. It wasn't intentional cruelty, it was worse. It was indifference so complete that I might as well not have existed at all. In that moment, I looked at the fork in my hand, set it down carefully, and understood the truth. If I walked away, if I vanished from their lives completely, they wouldn't even notice. The thought was terrifying in its clarity. For weeks afterward, I wrestled with that idea, testing it in my mind like a dangerous secret. I went about my life, visiting less and less often, answering fewer calls, already fading out of their world while they carried on as though nothing had changed. And one evening, I realized there was no grand speech I needed to make, no confrontation, no tearful goodbye. I could simply slip out, quietly, without permission, without acknowledgement. I could remove myself from the equation they had written without me in the first place. So one night, I did. I packed what little I cared about, turned off my phone, and left behind a family that never really saw me. They didn't ask questions, they didn't chase after me, they didn't even flinch. Their golden boys were still there, so why would my absence matter? That silence confirmed everything I had feared and everything I already knew. But silence has an echo, and mine would come back to them louder than any words. What I didn't realize then was how much noise my quiet disappearance would eventually make. Because when the golden boys began to crack and stumble, when the walls of my parents' carefully polished kingdom started to cave in, the first person they thought to call wasn't their precious sons. It was me, the daughter they had pretended didn't exist. And that's when everything changed. I learned quickly that silence is not empty, it is crowded with all the things people never thought they would have to hear, and when I turned my phone back on after a week of clean quiet, the kind of quiet where you notice the hum of the refrigerator and the soft tick of the baseboard heater, like signs of life in a new apartment with thin walls and honest rent. I saw a stacked column of missed calls and voicemails that looked less like concern and more like smoke from a fire someone tried to stamp out with polished shoes. The first message was my mother doing that high, brittle voice that used to appear when company arrived and she wanted to seem gentle, asking whether I was free to chat about something small, which in our family always meant something big and messy that had to be handled by someone other than the golden boys, because big and messy required focus, lists, and follow-through, and the boys did confidence and charm, but not duct tape and deadlines. The second message was my father, a muttered mix of irritation and forced warmth, saying there had been a hiccup with some paperwork and that he thought I would know what to do, which made me laugh out loud in the kitchen because the last time he asked for my help it had been a science fair in middle school, and he never showed up to see the project that actually worked. I let the messages pile up while I settled into a life that felt like it belonged to an adult who answered to herself, not to a chorus of expectations, and I built small routines that felt like declarations, morning jogs in a city where no one recognized me, grocery shopping on Sunday afternoons when the store smelled like coffee and fruit instead of the old house smell of scorched butter and arguments, a cheap yoga class where I learned to breathe all the way down into my ribs and exhale the family static that had lived there for decades. I took the job that had been offered by a woman who valued competence over theatrics. I brought a plant to my desk and kept it alive. I let myself enjoy the ridiculous luxury of choosing dinner without calculating who would criticize it. And every once in a while I pressed play on a voicemail like a scientist running a controlled experiment to measure levels of panic in a captive species. By the end of the week the pitch had risen. My mother was now invoking words like family and duty and after everything we've done for you, which landed with the thud of all the birthdays no one remembered and all the rides no one gave, while my father said there were time-sensitive items and that my brothers were handling as much as they can, a line that told me the golden boys were bouncing like pinballs off consequences they had never had to absorb head-on. I do not pretend I did not feel the tug, because the tug is real and it lives in the spine, not the brain. Every American daughter who stepped into adulthood with a reliable spreadsheet and a battered heart knows that tug. And for a day I stood in my new living room staring at a box of kitchen utensils while wondering whether I was the kind of person who left people to drown when she could throw a rope. Then I remembered every dinner table where I was expected to be useful but not visible, every time my competence was borrowed without my name attached, every late-night panic my mother brought to my door when one brother had driven into a fence and the other had accidentally forgotten a payment that somehow landed on my credit because someone had entered my contact email on a shared account, and the tug loosened into something calmer and sharper, boundaries written in ink, not pencil. So I made coffee that tasted like a decision. I sat at my laptop, and I drafted my terms of contact, 3 pages, clear and kind, printed on plain paper like a contract you sign when you care about what happens next. I wrote that I would be willing to consider a conversation if 3 conditions were met. First, a written acknowledgement of the patterns that had made contact impossible for years, not a poem and not a confession. Just a factual statement that remembered what I remember. Second, a donation to the women's shelter in our old zip code in an amount that used to fund my brother's ski trips, which I rendered as whatever you once considered a reasonable weekend, because I wanted them to face their own scale. Third, agreement that all future communication would go through email during business hours so no one used midnight as a weapon again. I mailed it certified because paper that arrives with a signature requirement makes people read every line, and then I set my phone to send. Any number from home to a gentle auto-reply that said, with politeness sharpened to a point, that I had received their message and would respond within a reasonable window if the agreed terms were met. It was petty only if you think boundaries are petty. To me it felt like putting a frame around a painting that had hung crooked for too long. And the satisfaction landed with heat in my hands when the delivery confirmation popped up the next morning and the voicemail counter began to bloom like a wild plant left alone in good weather. My mother's tone cracked first, less brittle now and more desperate, telling me she didn't understand the hostility, which made me smile because I had used exactly 0 hostile words, and then she tried a softer angle, promising that things would be different moving forward without specifying what different meant, which I flagged mentally as the kind of vague fix that breaks on first contact with reality. My father left a message that was just breathing for several seconds before he said my name, the way you test a microphone to see if anyone is listening, and then he added a phrase that felt like a key scraping a lock I did not know I owned. He said there was a file with my signature attached to an account that did not belong to me. He said there had been a mix-up years ago when we were setting things up for the boys. He said the word liability in a tone that suggested the rope I imagined throwing back might be tied around my own ankle, and then he said that a deadline was approaching and that without me, something would fall. And this time the voicemail did not feel like smoke or manipulation. It felt like a tremor that runs under your feet before the shelves move. When my father's voice mentioned liability and deadlines, I understood instantly that their sudden interest in me was not about affection, not about missed birthdays or forgotten rides, but about survival. And survival in my family had always meant shoving responsibility onto the person most capable of carrying it. That person had never been one of the golden boys, whose charm ran hot but short, like a sparkler that burned bright and fizzled before the music ended. It had always been me, the invisible one, the one who could fix the printer jam, balance the checkbook, or remember the password no one else bothered to write down. Now, from the tone in his breathy pause, I knew the stakes had outgrown printers and bills. Something was collapsing, and my absence had torn a hole they couldn't patch with excuses. I replayed that voicemail more times than I want to admit, pacing my apartment with the blinds drawn as though the sound itself could summon consequences through the walls. I thought about the way my father had always used legal words like warning shots, ownership, agreement, binding, without ever clarifying who held the paper or the power. I thought about my mother, smiling as she slid documents across the counter to my brothers, who signed with lazy grins while I was asked to notarize or witness, always the reliable signature in the margins. The more I thought, the colder the realization grew. My name might already be tethered to something heavy, something that would not sink my parents alone, but me with them. I opened my laptop and, for the first time in months, typed in the family's old shared banking site. I had not touched it since I left, had sworn I never would, but curiosity and fear are close cousins. Passwords I remembered with muscle memory unlocked an account that was supposed to be simple, joint emergency savings, my parents said years ago, for the family, just in case. What I saw was not emergency savings but a funnel, money rushing out in fat, regular withdrawals to cover debts I had never agreed to share. And there, tucked among the withdrawals, were my initials, recorded as an electronic cosigner from a date that blurred sickeningly into my timeline of early adulthood, a period when I was still living at home. Still naive enough to sign what my mother placed in front of me because she said it was just a backup for something minor. It wasn't minor. It was a loan the size of a house, one that had been feeding my brother's grand lifestyles like a hidden artery. Ski trips, sports cars, failed ventures disguised as bold investments. Each dollar had been drawn from a pool with my name tied to its walls, and now the pool was dry, the collectors were circling, and my parents had finally looked up from the wreckage long enough to remember that their invisible daughter existed. The irony stung deeper than the betrayal itself. They had spent years convincing me that my presence was a burden, that I was forgettable, replaceable, unnecessary. Yet now, when the towers they built for their sons had cracked, I was not only necessary, I was essential. Without me, without my cooperation, The whole illusion collapsed into debt, lawsuits, and maybe even the kind of public scandal they had always believed would never touch our family. The family that had erased me now wanted me to stand on the front line and absorb the impact. The next week was a blur of calls I didn't answer, emails I didn't return, and late-night pacing where I battled between two instincts: the trained reflex to clean up after them, to steady the chaos, and the raw, rebellious surge that told me to let it all burn. My phone filled with voicemails in escalating tones. First came my mother, whispering tearfully about misunderstandings and not knowing how this happened. Then my father, whose anger cracked through like lightning, warning me about legal consequences and family obligations. Finally, my brothers themselves, voices I had heard 1,000 times mocking me, now awkwardly polite, as if respect could be stapled together in desperation. I will admit I considered answering, not out of pity for them, but out of fear for myself. If my name was on those documents, if liability was real, walking away might not be enough. But fear has an odd way of clarifying the truth. I realized that for once, the power was mine. Their empire of favoritism had run on my quiet compliance, my willingness to stay small, my habit of saying yes. The minute I withheld those things, their world began to fracture. So I stayed silent, a silence so deliberate it felt like music, a silence that made them dance in circles, guessing, pleading, cajoling, raging. And each time I replayed those desperate messages, I felt the scales tip further, because now they were the ones unseen, their words bouncing against a wall I refused to lower. The cliff edge came when my father's latest voicemail cut short, ending with a phrase so jagged, I had to sit down to replay it. "If you don't help us, you'll go down with us." For a moment the threat rattled my bones, but then, slowly, I smiled. Because if he had to say it, it meant they knew the truth. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one drowning. They were. And I held the rope, whether I chose to throw it or not. When the messages began arriving in rapid succession, each one more frantic and convoluted than the last, I realized that the gravity of their situation was fully settling in, not as a moment of clarity or moral reckoning, but as a raw, desperate recognition that their carefully constructed world was crumbling and that their golden sons, who had been lauded for charm and impulse, were wholly incapable of navigating the chaos they themselves had created. My mother's voice, once measured and distant, now quivered with every word, carrying the weight of panic disguised in pleading tones, begging me to intervene, to fix what had spiraled beyond their comprehension, and to repair bridges that had been ignored for decades. Yet the most remarkable element of her barrage was not the requests themselves, but the fact that she had finally acknowledged, in fragments of sentences broken by gasps and sighs, that my presence, my skills, my decisions were the only thing keeping them from complete and public disaster. My father, who had spent years projecting an aura of invincibility, now sounded fractured, his language formal yet uneven, alternating between threats of legal consequence, overt entreaties for assistance, and desperate attempts to cloak their failures in the kind of vague explanations that never held any real meaning, and I found myself observing them not with compassion or anger, but with an almost academic detachment, noting how the structure of their pleas revealed both the depth of their dependency on me and the utter lack of preparedness of the sons they had once deemed infallible. Every phone call, every email, every voice message reinforced the idea that they had lived for years in a distorted system of favoritism, where my brothers could do no wrong and I was only a peripheral observer, and now that the tides had shifted, the same system they had built to protect the heirs had become the trap into which they fell headlong, and the realization that I could navigate this crisis without them made me feel a strength I had never known, a power that came not from malice, but from the acknowledgement that my own life had value, competence, and resilience independent of the chaos that had long surrounded me. I watched their frantic attempts to gain my attention, to manipulate and persuade, and for the first time I understood the profound impact of absence, how it can serve as both boundary and weapon, and how a life ignored for decades can suddenly become indispensable when the facade of control collapses. I spent days crafting my response, or rather, crafting the framework through which I would control my response, because the act of answering, of re-engaging, had to be deliberate, calculated, and precise, ensuring that the dynamics of power, long skewed against me, were finally leveled in a way that exposed the consequences of years of neglect and favoritism. I wrote in measured language, emphasizing clarity and professionalism, acknowledging the situation without injecting emotion, outlining the specific actions I would require before any direct engagement could occur. And in doing so, I felt the strange satisfaction of drawing lines that had never existed in my family, lines that were enforced not through confrontation, but through reason, expectation, and the quiet assertion of authority that I had cultivated silently for years. My decisions were deliberate, my boundaries non-negotiable, and the act of withholding immediate action became a form of retribution that was both subtle and profound, because it forced them to confront the reality that the Golden Boys were not saviors and that their past treatment of me had consequences they could not anticipate. As the hours passed and the pleas intensified, I observed my mother attempting to rally sympathy, using the language of familial obligation to mask the vulnerability she had never shown. While my father oscillated between panic and an insistence on procedure, each sentence betraying the underlying fear that without my intervention, the family's image and finances would crumble irreversibly. And the irony of their predicament was not lost on me, because the very sons they had elevated, whose every whim had been indulged, were proving insufficient at every turn, leaving them helpless and dependent on the one individual they had habitually dismissed and undermined. The tension built with each passing message, each line written or spoken dripping with the realization that their assumptions about loyalty, competence, and resilience were flawed, and that the daughter they had ignored, belittled, and treated as invisible was now the singular axis around which the resolution of their crises pivoted. In that space, I discovered a profound clarity and a sense of equilibrium I had never felt, because the same family that had spent decades minimizing my existence was now compelled to seek my presence, to appeal to the skills, judgment, and authority they had once derided, and the act of choosing when and how to respond became my assertion of autonomy, my measure of control over the narrative that had been written without my consent, and the satisfaction I derived from this strategic withholding was neither cruel nor vindictive in the traditional sense, but it was undeniably powerful because it forced them to reconcile with the consequences of their favoritism and neglect in a way that no lecture, confrontation, or emotional appeal could ever have achieved. The final voicemail that arrived that evening captured the essence of their desperation, a blend of confusion, acknowledgement, and thinly veiled threat, and as I listened to it, I felt the unmistakable sense that the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. That the family dynamics they had carefully orchestrated had been appended by years of my quiet competence and deliberate absence, and that the only resolution, if there was one, would be determined on my terms, in my time, with my presence, being both a lifeline and a measure of accountability that could no longer be ignored. The messages continued arriving, relentless and anxious, and as I listened to each one, I understood that the dynamic had shifted entirely, for the first time in my life. The people who had dismissed me as invisible were forced to confront the undeniable reality that I possessed knowledge, skills, and judgment that they could not replace, and that their golden sons, who had always been praised and indulged, were incapable of correcting the chaos their parents had allowed to accumulate. My mother's voice, previously so measured and distant, now trembled with desperation, each word a carefully constructed attempt to elicit empathy and compliance, yet simultaneously betraying fear that their carefully maintained illusion of control had completely eroded. My father's tone, which had always carried authority and the illusion of certainty, now revealed cracks, wavering between warnings of legal consequence and tentative pleas for guidance, underscoring the fact that their long-held assumptions about loyalty, capability, and resilience were deeply flawed, and that they were now dependent upon the very person they had marginalized for decades. I took time to read between the lines of their pleas, noticing patterns and inconsistencies. discerning which elements were genuine acknowledgments of responsibility and which were strategic manipulations aimed at eliciting my involvement without admitting culpability. And I realized that the power I held in this moment was extraordinary not because it allowed me to punish them, but because it enabled me to define the terms of engagement, to assert boundaries that had never existed, and to insist upon respect that had long been denied. The irony of their situation was not lost on me. They had cultivated children who were charming, impulsive, and untested in crisis, and now they were forced to rely on someone whose existence they had routinely overlooked. Someone whose competence they had belittled and whose presence they had dismissed as irrelevant, and in the gap between their expectations and reality, I discovered an unprecedented clarity and control. I did not respond immediately, though the urge to intervene tugged at me, for to act hastily would have diminished the strategic advantage that had taken decades to cultivate, and instead I observed, considered, and planned. Recognizing that my silence was a form of power, a methodical assertion of agency that demonstrated, far more effectively than confrontation or anger ever could, the consequences of neglect and favoritism. Each message that arrived reinforced the gravity of the shift. My mother's tone fluctuated between desperation and guilt, oscillating in a way that made it clear she was attempting to reconcile her long-standing indifference with the urgent reality before her. While my father's language grew increasingly formal, bureaucratic even, revealing both his discomfort with vulnerability and his dependence on a daughter he had habitually discounted. My brothers, who had once been untouchable in their parents' eyes, now submitted tentative inquiries, their charm and confidence replaced by uncertainty and the faint acknowledgement that their previous accomplishments offered no solution to the problems at hand. I crafted my response with deliberate care, understanding that it needed to balance acknowledgement with authority, empathy with boundary, and clarity with finality. I affirmed the existence of the crisis, outlined the parameters under which I would engage, and insisted upon recognition of the patterns of neglect that had brought us to this point, ensuring that each term I specified required reflection, accountability, and action from my parents before any direct involvement on my part could proceed. The act of drafting this response, of formalizing the conditions under which I would participate, provided a profound sense of satisfaction, not from retribution, but from the long-awaited assertion of agency and control over a narrative that had consistently minimized my presence and contributions. When I finally sent the message, I felt a quiet release, a sense that the scales had been balanced in a manner that was precise, deliberate, and unassailable. The subsequent silence that followed was filled with tension, anticipation, and recognition, as my parents and brothers absorbed the implications of my terms, realizing that their previous assumptions about influence, obedience, and capability were irrevocably altered. The power dynamic had shifted, and in that shift, I found both freedom and justice. My past marginalization had been rectified not through confrontation or aggression, but through the careful, measured application of absence, observation, and controlled engagement, a methodology that underscored the truth that the value they had overlooked was, in fact, the axis upon which the resolution of their crises now depended. The final moments arrived in the form of a single, carefully composed voicemail from my mother, her voice a mixture of fear, recognition, and apology, admitting for the first time the consequences of years of favoritism and neglect, acknowledging that they had misjudged my role, my competence, and my worth, and for a fleeting moment, I allowed myself to hear the words as they were intended, without distortion, without bitterness, and without the necessity of immediate action. Yet, even as I listened, I recognized the enduring ambiguity of the situation. Acknowledgement does not erase history, and apology does not compel trust. I deleted the message, closed the laptop, and leaned back, fully aware that my choice to remain detached, to engage only on my terms, was both a resolution and a lesson, a final act that would shape the family's understanding of value, agency, and consequence for years to come. In that quiet, deliberate withdrawal, I discovered the ultimate form of empowerment, the ability to exist on my own terms, to dictate engagement through choice rather than obligation, and to allow silence to resonate louder than any words they could have offered, leaving the ultimate resolution suspended in thought, reflection, and the lingering weight of responsibility that they alone would now bear.